The story, as the world was first invited to see it, was one of the most beautiful of its age. There was a woman of extraordinary looks, a former model who had appeared in the pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, a red-haired beauty who had been given a Hollywood screen test and who moved through the great rooms of 2 continents as though she had been born to them. There was a fortune, one of the most famous industrial fortunes in America, founded on an invention that had helped to build the modern world. There was a handsome, brilliant husband who called himself a writer and an explorer. There was an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where the guests at dinner might include Greta Garbo, or Tennessee Williams, or the novelist William Styron. And there was a son, a beautiful boy, clever and sensitive and adored, the golden child of a golden family, carried through the cities of Europe from Paris to Rome to the Spanish coast, in a life that most people could only read about in magazines. That was the picture. Hold it in your mind, because almost nothing about it was what it seemed, and the family in that photograph was moving, year by year, glamorous stop by glamorous stop, toward one of the most harrowing domestic catastrophes of the 20th century. The beauty was real, the fortune was real, the famous friends were real, and underneath all of it, something was rotting, quietly, and then not quietly, until it ended on a kitchen floor in a penthouse in Chelsea, with a mother dead of a single knife wound and her son on the telephone, in the next room, calmly ordering dinner to be delivered. Tonight we revisit one case that has never stopped disturbing the people who study it, because it cannot be filed under the easy headings. One family, immense in its wealth and its charm, and a destruction that money made worse rather than better. The case of Barbara Baekeland begins, as these things so often secretly do, a generation before the crime, in the childhood of the woman who would die. She was born Barbara Daly on the 28th of September 1921 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She grew into a beauty of the kind that opens doors, striking and red-haired and magnetic, the sort of young woman who is told from an early age that she is exceptional and comes to build her whole self around the telling. But beneath the beauty was a wound that had been laid down early and never healed. When Barbara was 11 years old, her father, a man named Frank Daly, took his own life. He ran the engine of the family car in a closed garage and died of the fumes. A girl of 11 lost her father to suicide, to a deliberate death by a quiet and invisible poison. And that fact sits at the very bottom of this story, like a stone at the bottom of a well. Everything that Barbara Baekeland later became, the hunger for attention, the terror of being left, the swings between radiance and black despair, grew in the soil of that early and devastating loss. She and her mother, Nina, moved to New York, and Barbara set out to make herself into someone no one could ever abandon again. She would spend the rest of her life failing at exactly that. She modeled. She acted a little, or tried to. She was given a screen test in Hollywood opposite the actor Dana Andrews, and it came to nothing, and the failure stung, because Barbara wanted more than beauty. She wanted to be significant, and significance, in the world she moved through, meant marrying it. In the person of Brooks Baekeland she found it. The Baekeland name was one of the golden names of American industry. And the reason why is a detail that sits at the strange, dark heart of this whole story. Brooks Baekeland was the grandson of Leo Baekeland, a Belgian-born chemist who in 1907 in a laboratory in New York had invented the first true synthetic plastic. He called it Bakelite. It was one of the most important inventions of the century, a hard, moldable, man-made material that could be pressed into any shape and would not burn, would not melt, would not conduct electricity, and above all, would not break. They called it the material of 1,000 uses. It went into telephones and radios and electrical fittings and jewelry and the handles of 1 million everyday things, and it made the Baekeland family staggeringly rich. Remember what Bakelite was. It was a material prized above all because you could pour it into a mold, force it into whatever shape you desired, and it would hold that shape forever and never crack. Hold that thought, because a generation later, a Baekeland woman would try to do to a living human being exactly what old Leo Baekeland had done to his famous plastic. She would try to force her son into the shape she wanted, and she would learn that a boy is not Bakelite. Barbara married Brooks Baekeland after telling him she was pregnant, which she was not, a lie to secure a man she was determined to have. They were a spectacular couple, the beautiful aspiring actress and the brilliant heir, and they set up in Manhattan and began the life of parties and famous friends that the world would later remember as the golden image. Brooks Baekeland was a complicated man to be married to. He was intelligent, restless, and proud, a would-be writer and adventurer who carried the weight of a famous name and the private conviction that he had never quite done anything of his own to deserve it. He and Barbara struck sparks off each other, dazzling and glamorous in company and savage in private, two people who seemed to require an audience even for their unhappiness. They drank. They betrayed each other and forgave each other and betrayed each other again. And they did all of it in front of their son, who grew up treating the chaos of his parents' marriage as the ordinary weather of a family, because it was the only weather he had ever known. But the marriage was troubled almost from the start. Barbara was by many accounts a woman of enormous charm and enormous instability, capable of lighting up a room, and then, without warning, of savage outbursts, of public scenes, of long plunges into depression, softened with drink. She had affairs, so eventually did he, and into that glittering, unstable marriage, on the 28th of August, 1946, a son was born. They named him Anthony. His family called him Tony. I want you to understand who this child was, because he is the second victim of this story, as surely as his mother is the first, and the tragedy cannot be understood if you see him only as the young man who held the knife. Tony Baekeland was, by every account, a lovely boy, gentle, artistic, unusually sensitive, close to his mother, in a way that everyone around them noticed, and that would in time curdle into something terrible. From 1954, the family gave up any fixed home and began to live as wealthy wanderers, renting beautiful houses across Europe, in London and Paris, in Switzerland and the south of France, in Italy and on the Spanish coast, a childhood of astonishing privilege and almost no stability. A boy raised in grand rented rooms among his parents' brilliant, drinking, quarreling friends, belonging nowhere, enrolled in this school and then that one, forming no lasting anchor except the one anchor that was always there, his mother. Barbara and Tony were bound together with a closeness that outsiders found unsettling long before anyone imagined where it would lead. There was real promise in Tony, and that is part of what makes his ruin so hard to read. He wrote, he drew and painted a little. He had inherited his mother's beauty and something of her charm, and in his better years he could be tender and funny and startlingly perceptive, the kind of young man people wanted to be near. Friends of the family remembered a boy of genuine gifts. But he had been raised inside a marriage that used him as both a weapon and a prize, a beautiful only child pulled back and forth between two brilliant, competitive, unhappy parents, and he had never once in his life been given the plain ordinary thing that a child needs more than beautiful houses, which is the steady sense that the ground beneath him would hold. His mother loved him too much, and in the wrong way. His father, by his own later admission, struggled to love him much at all. Between the two of them the boy had no solid place to stand, and when his mind began to give way in his 20s, there was nothing underneath to catch him. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. As Tony grew into a young man, two things became clear, and Barbara Baekeland could accept neither of them. The first was that her son was falling ill in his mind. In his late teens and early 20s, he began to show the signs of what would be diagnosed as schizophrenia, a serious and frightening mental illness with episodes of paranoia and disordered thinking and a slow retreat from the shared world into a private one. The second was that Tony was drawn to men. In 1967, at the age of 20, staying at Cadaqués on the Spanish coast, he formed a relationship with a man. And when Barbara learned of it, she reacted not as a mother frightened for a mentally ill son, but as a woman personally affronted, as though her beautiful boy had been stolen from her. It is worth pausing to remember the world that told Barbara Baekeland her son was broken, because she did not invent that idea, she absorbed it. In the 1960s, across America and Europe alike, homosexuality was still widely classified as a mental illness, a disorder to be diagnosed and treated, and, if possible, cured. Respectable doctors offered supposed cures for it. Respectable families spoke of it as a catastrophe, a shame, a thing to be corrected quietly before anyone found out. Barbara's conviction that her son's nature was a defect she could fix was a ruinous and cruel idea, but it was not a private madness she alone had dreamed up. It was the settled prejudice of an entire era, distilled into one obsessive mother who happened to have limitless money and no restraint at all. That does not lessen by a single ounce what she did to him, but it places it, and it should make anyone watching this a little uneasy about how confidently a whole society once pronounced healthy people sick. What she did next belongs to the darkest and most difficult part of this account, and I am going to tell it plainly and without sensation, because it is the hinge of the whole tragedy, and it deserves to be understood rather than gawked at. Barbara Baekeland decided that she would cure her son of his homosexuality. She treated it as a defect to be corrected, a wrong shape to be pressed back into the right one. She began by arranging for women, prostitutes, to sleep with him, in the belief that the right experience would remake him. And when that failed, according to the accounts that emerged later, she took the final and unforgivable step herself. In Majorca, in the summer of 1968, Barbara Baekeland is said to have engaged in an incestuous relationship with her own son, in the terrible conviction that she could love him into being someone else. There are no words adequate to what that did to a young man already losing his grip on reality. A mother is meant to be the one fixed safe point in a person's world, the boundary that makes all other closeness possible. Barbara took that boundary, the deepest and most protective one a family has, and she destroyed it, and she did it while telling herself, and perhaps even believing, that she was helping him. Whatever fragile scaffolding was still holding Tony Baekeland's mind together, this pulled it down. From this point, the two of them were locked together in something that was no longer a family at all. A mother and a son fused into a single unstable mass, each the other's whole world, each the other's captor. The people around them watched with growing horror and did, in the way of people around the very rich, almost nothing. The rest of the family fell away. In February of 1968, Barbara discovered that Brooks had begun an affair with a young Spanish woman, and the marriage ended. Brooks left. Barbara, abandoned by the husband and clinging to spiraled into the worst of her depressions. She attempted suicide and was saved on at least one occasion by a friend. She pursued a brief and consuming affair with a New York art curator, and when it ended, she was seen walking barefoot across Central Park in the snow, wearing nothing but a fur coat to hammer on his door. This was a woman coming apart. The friends who tell these stories tell them now with a kind of retrospective horror, because at the time they were passed around as anecdotes, as the outrageous and glamorous doings of a woman everyone found exhausting and magnetic in equal measure. Barbara Baekeland was, to the people around her, a great character, a spectacle, a reliable source of gossip at 100 dinner tables. Almost no one seems to have looked at the barefoot woman in the snow and seen what was actually standing there, which was a person drowning in plain sight. in an expensive coat, in the middle of one of the richest cities on earth. She was surrounded by clever people, and she was profoundly and dangerously alone. And the only company she had left was the son she was destroying, and who would in the end destroy her. And the only person still bound to her, still trapped in the orbit of her enormous and devouring need, was the son whose mind was collapsing and whom she had wronged past all repair. By 1972, the people who knew them were frightened. Tony's illness had turned dangerous, and in late July of that year, outside the apartment his mother was renting at Cadogan Square in Chelsea, in London, Tony Baekeland tried to kill her for the first time. He attempted to push her into the traffic on the street. She was saved only because a bystander, a woman passing by, caught hold of her and pulled her back from the road. The police were involved. Tony had, in plain daylight, tried to murder his mother in front of a witness. And Barbara Baekeland refused to press charges. She would not have him taken from her, not even to save her own life. She had him admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and then, when he wished to leave, she had him released because she could not bear the separation any more than he could. Here is the moment that, for me, is the unbearable center of the whole story. In the autumn of 1972, a psychiatrist who understood exactly what Tony Baekeland was and exactly what he was capable of spoke to Barbara directly. He warned her in words that have come down to us almost exactly that she was in grave danger, that her son might well kill her, and Barbara Baekeland answered him. She said, in effect, that she did not believe it. Told plainly by a doctor that her child would take her life, she waved it away. She had been warned by the traffic. She had been warned by the hospital. She had now been warned in the clearest possible language by a professional whose job was to know. And she chose her son over the warning every single time, because to accept the warning would have meant giving him up, and giving him up was the one thing Barbara Baekeland had spent her whole broken life being unable to do. The girl who lost her father at 11 had built her entire self around never being left again. She would rather die than be left. In the end, she got exactly that. On the 17th of November 1972, in the penthouse at Cadogan Square, it happened. Tony Baekeland took a kitchen knife and he stabbed his mother, and the wound was such that she died almost at once. She was 51 years old, he was 26, and then, having killed the one person to whom he had been bound his entire life, Tony Baekeland did something that tells you more about the state of his mind than any diagnosis could. He picked up the telephone, and he ordered food. When the police arrived at the scene of the killing, they found the young man calm, unhurried, waiting for a delivery of Chinese food to arrive, his mother dead on the floor nearby, as though the most ordinary evening in the world were unfolding around him. Pause, I need you to stay with the horror of that image for a moment, because it is the whole illness in a single frame. A young man who has just destroyed his own mother and feels in that moment nothing at all that the rest of us would recognize, only the ordinary small hunger of an ordinary evening. This is not the coldness of cruelty. It is the terrible absence that severe mental illness can leave where a person used to be. If this account is holding you the way it holds me, share it with someone who understands that some of the darkest stories in the record are not stories of cruelty at all, but of sickness that no one would treat and love that had gone entirely wrong. Now let us follow it to its end, because the end reaches down through the whole family and does not spare a single generation. Tony Baekeland was tried in London at the Old Bailey in June of 1973. There was never any question that he had killed his mother. The question was what he was, and the court answered it the only way a just court could. He was found not guilty of murder but guilty of manslaughter, on the grounds of diminished responsibility, because he was profoundly and diagnosably mentally ill. He was not sent to an ordinary prison. He was committed to Broadmoor, the high-security psychiatric hospital in Berkshire, to be held there indefinitely. For as long as he remained a danger, the verdict was, by the law's lights, correct and even merciful. A man too ill to be held fully responsible was treated as ill rather than simply wicked, which is what a humane legal system is supposed to do. And yet there is a bitter irony folded inside that mercy, because the same illness that spared Tony Baekeland the label of murderers was the illness that no one in his gilded, drifting family had been willing to treat while there was still time to treat it. The court in 1973 extended to him the seriousness his own people had withheld for a decade. The law took his sickness seriously at last. It was 10 years too late for his mother, and, as things would turn out, not nearly early enough to save the one member of the family, still to be harmed. And for a while the story seemed to have reached the only resting place such a story can reach: a sick man confined, a dead woman buried, a shattering family tragedy sealed away behind hospital walls. But it was not over, and the way it went on is almost harder to bear than the killing itself. After nearly 8 years, in July of 1980, Tony Baekeland was released from Broadmoor. The doctors judged him well enough. His friends had urged it. He was let out, and he flew to New York, to the one relative who would take him in, an old woman who loved him. His grandmother, Nina Daly, Barbara's mother, the same woman who had lost her own husband to suicide and her daughter to a knife, now opened her door to the grandson who had wielded it because he had nowhere else to go, and because she, too, could not give him up. 6 days later, Tony Baekeland attacked her. He took a kitchen knife, the same domestic weapon he had used on his mother, and he stabbed his 87-year-old grandmother 8 times and broke several of her bones. Astonishingly, she survived. She even, it is said, tried to protect him afterward. But this time there was no avoiding prison, and Tony Baekeland was taken to Rikers Island, the New York jail, to await the resolution of his case. He did not wait long. On the 20th of March, 1981, expecting to be granted bail, he learned instead that his hearing had been adjourned because his medical records had not arrived from England in time. He was returned to his cell. Within about half an hour, he was dead. Tony Baekeland had killed himself, suffocating himself with a plastic bag stop, and see the whole shape of it now across 3 generations, because this is the detail that turns a terrible crime into something closer to a curse. Barbara Baekeland's father killed himself with gas and invisible poison in a closed garage when she was a child. Barbara married into the family that invented plastic, the family whose fortune was built on a synthetic material poured into molds and prized because it would never break. Barbara spent her life trying to pour her own son into a mold and remake his shape, and she broke the one bond that was holding him together, and Tony, having killed the mother who would not stop trying to reshape him, ended his own life with a plastic bag, the very material his family's name had given to the world, held over his own face in a jail cell. The unbreakable material, the family it could not save. A grandfather's suicide by gas and a grandson's suicide by plastic, with a murdered woman in between, all of them wealthy beyond most people's imagining, and none of it, not $1 of it, able to buy a single one of them a way out. What does this case reveal about the world that produced it? It reveals what money does and does not do when a mind begins to fail. The Baekelands could buy anything. They could buy beautiful houses in a dozen countries, and famous friends, and the best addresses, and the appearance, from the outside, of a charmed and enviable life. What they could not do, or would not do, was the ordinary unglamorous thing that might have saved them, which was to face plainly and early that a child was seriously ill, and that a mother was seriously ill, and to accept the boring, painful, humbling help that facing it would have required. Wealth gave them the means to keep moving, to keep renting the next beautiful house, to keep the parties going and the illness hidden, to refuse the diagnosis and dismiss the warning and paper over each catastrophe with money and distance and charm. Poverty exposes a family's troubles to the world, sometimes brutally, Wealth allows a family to conceal them, sometimes fatally. The Baekelands had every resource except the willingness to use those resources on the truth, and so the truth, when it finally arrived at the point of a kitchen knife. A poorer family with the same illnesses might have been dragged by sheer necessity into the view of doctors and courts and social workers years before it came to killing. The Baekelands had the money to stay hidden until it was much too late. I keep returning to that warning and to her answer, and I would like to know what you make of it, so tell me below. A doctor looked at Barbara Baekeland and told her that her son would kill her, and she said she did not believe it, and within weeks she was dead by his hand, exactly as she had been warned. Was that blindness? Was it denial so total that it amounted to a kind of madness of her own, or was it, in some way she could never have said aloud, a choice, the choice of a woman who had decided long ago that she would rather be destroyed by the one person she could not give up than survive by giving him away? I do not know the answer. I am not sure there is one. But I would rather sit in that hard question honestly than pretend this was a simple story of a wicked son and an innocent mother, because it was nothing so clean as that. The penthouse at Cadogan Square is still there, an expensive address in an expensive part of London, and the people who live behind those white stucco fronts today have, most of them, no idea that one of the strangest and saddest killings of the century happened in a set of rooms so near their own. The record remains. It holds the court file from the Old Bailey, the psychiatric reports, the pages of an oral history in which the family's own friends, decades later, tried and failed to make sense of what they had watched unfold. It holds the whole terrible shape of it, the beauty and the fortune and the famous names on the outside, and on the inside a mother and a son who loved each other into ruin. Her name was Barbara Baekeland. She was a beauty who wanted to be significant, a girl who lost her father to a quiet poison and swore she would never be left again, a woman who did a grievous and lasting harm to her own child in the conviction that she was saving him, and who was in the end both the author of a great harm and the victim of the greatest one. She was warned that her son would kill her, and she would not let him go, and he killed her. And then in his sickness he followed her out of the world, with the same family's plastic held over his face. The fortune that made the Baekeland name is still in the objects all around us, in the old telephones and radios, and the hard black handles of 100 everyday things, the material that would not break, the family that made it shattered completely. And somewhere in that gap, between the thing that could not be broken and the people who could not be saved, is the whole of what happened to Barbara Baekeland and to the beautiful, ruined boy who could never, in the end, be poured into any shape but his own.